Let the world quieten now. Let the rush of your day drift away like mist across a still fjord at dawn. We begin, not in the clang and clash of battle, but in the hush of morning fog rolling over a quiet village, somewhere on the western coast of what you would now call Norway. The sea, ever a patient old friend to the people here, laps against the rocky shores in a rhythm older than memory. In this village, where rooftops are thatched and the cold air tastes faintly of salt and pine, your life begins. Not as a warrior, not yet, but as a daughter of the earth and the sea. You were born in a longhouse with walls of timber and a roof heavy with turf, its chimney perpetually smoking with the scent of pine and roasted fish. Your mother, Fridas, had the quiet hands of a weaver and the sharper tongue of a storyteller. She would often speak to your sleeping form as if the sagas of the gods could be passed down like lullabies. Your father, Ulfar, was rarely home, but when he was, his presence filled the space like thunderclouds gathering on the horizon, not menacing, but impossible to ignore. In this early chapter of your life, you are no Shieldmaiden. You are simply you, barefoot most days, your hair forever catching the wind, your small fingers always sticky with berry juice or tangled in wool. The village is your world, its boundaries defined by the forest behind and the sea ahead. Everything, beyond is myth carried to your ears by passing skalds or traders from the east. You remember your first winter clearly, or at least what your mind has shaped into memory. The cold was not cruel but clever, seeping into everything like a guest that overstays. Snow blanketed the world in silence, turning even the loudest men into whisperers. You spent much of those days tucked near the hearth, listening to the slow telling of tales by old Astrid, the elder woman whose fingers never stopped moving over her spindle. She smelled of smoke and mead, and always had a crust of flatbread hidden in her apron. It was from Astrid that you first heard of the Valkyries, those fierce women who chose the slain from the battlefield, their hair like lightning, their steeds galloping through storm clouds. You did not yet understand what it meant to fight or to fall, but the idea of riding the wind intrigued you deeply. Your best friend in those years was Bjorn, a boy with more freckles than sense. He was convinced trolls lived in the hills beyond the village, and he had the scraped knees and torn tunics to prove how often he went looking for them. You followed him once, heart pounding, hands clutched tightly around a piece of dried fish in case you needed to bribe a goblin. Of course, there were no trolls, just the whisper of pine needles and the deep stillness of snow that swallowed all sound. Evenings were the most magical time. The fire inside the longhouse cast shadows that danced along the walls like spirits. The grown-ups would drink, speak in low voices, and laugh too loudly at jokes that only made sense to them. You would lie beside your younger brother, his fingers always curled around yours, and watch the sparks drift up into the rafters as if trying to return to the stars. Once, in a late spring when the sun refused to set until deep into the night, you heard a strange sound, distant drums, not of war but of arrival. A ship had come, carved with dragon heads and lined with warriors in tunics dyed in rare hues. They brought stories of the Frankish coast and the lands where wine flowed freely. You watched them unload barrels and bolts of fabric, their eyes always scanning the village like wolves sizing up a new forest. One of them, a woman with silver threads in her hair and a long scar across her cheek, noticed you watching. She winked. "One day," she said, "you'll leave this place too. The sea remembers those who dream beside it." You didn't understand her then, but you remembered. The village lived by rhythm, like the tides. There were seasons of sowing and seasons of stillness. You learned to milk goats, to mend nets, to sing softly while turning the spit. Your mother let you carve runes into driftwood and scatter them in the stream. Messages, she said, for the spirits that watched over the cold places. Years passed, like snowfall, slow, quiet, but constant. Then came the day you were old enough to be given a blade. Not a sword, not yet. A small sayax, for carving and cutting kindling. But in your hand, it felt like promise. That night, you didn't sleep. You sat by the fire, tracing its pattern with your thumb until your skin tingled. It wasn't glory you longed for. It was understanding of what made the Valkyries choose, of what it meant to have a name remembered beyond the fjords. Outside, the wind shifted. The sea was calling. By the time your voice began to change and your feet no longer padded soundlessly over the packed earth of your home, you had grown into something more than a child, but not yet a warrior. The village began to treat you differently, as if watching, for signs, for choices. You were no longer expected merely to watch and listen. Now you were to weave, to gather, to prepare. Womanhood did not come like thunder. It arrived like snow, quiet and in layers. Your mother taught you to spin wool, with hands calloused by winters and softened by the oils of flax. It was work that seemed never-ending, and you often wondered how a warrior's hands could begin at the spindle. She told you then, gently but without pause in her task, strength is not always shown with a blade. Sometimes, it's in the patience to turn thread until it holds. You weren't sure if you believed her. Still, you practiced. Each motion of the spindle like a breath, round and round. It gave you time to think. Of the silver-haired Shieldmaiden you'd seen years before. Of Bjorn's wild tales. Of the way your father once held your hand over a burning brand to teach you not fear, but respect. Around this time, Bjorn began training with the older boys. He swung wooden swords with more enthusiasm than technique. You watched him from a distance, arms deep in a basket of nettles to be boiled into dye, your fingers burning. He caught your eye once and puffed out his chest. You smiled despite yourself. He had grown tall and all elbows. His dreams were louder than ever. You asked your mother once in the quiet of twilight if girls could train like that. She stopped stirring the pot, letting the spoon rest against the rim. Not all villages permit it, she said, choosing her words like stones on ice. But ours is not all villages. The next day she handed you a wooden staff. Keep the sheep away from the river, she said. It was not an order to fight, but it was a start. There were battles to be fought long before blades were drawn. You began learning to watch, to notice. The rhythm of hooves on earth, the way storm clouds moved over the fjord. How to tell when a goat was about to birth, or when someone lied by the twitch of an eye. Your hands stayed busy, but your mind wandered, sharpening like a knife over time and boredom. One autumn, a group of travelers arrived, a small family with dark hair and southern tongues fleeing a raid. They brought stories of cities built, of stone and lamps that burned with whale oil. Their daughter Sina was your age, but spoke like she'd lived 1,000 years. She'd seen the ocean from both ends, she said, and had once watched the northern lights dance over an Irish field. You two became close. Not like you and Bjorn. He was wild like the wind. But Sina was steady. You learned from her how to stitch faster, how to knot fishing line with one hand, how to braid your hair so it wouldn't fall in your eyes during work or wind. Together, you built a raft out of scrap wood and goat skins and tried to sail it down the river. It sank before it made it past the bend, but for the few seconds it floated, you both stood on it like queens. It was around this time that Astrid, the old spinner, passed away. You were the one who found her, curled like a comma near her hearth, her spindle still cradled in one hand. The village gathered to say farewell, each tossing a thread or bead into the fire in her memory. You tossed in the first rune you'd ever carved, the one she'd smiled at with toothless pride. After that, the hearth felt a little quieter. Even the fire seemed to burn softer for a time. In the weeks that followed, your mother began showing you how to read the weather in the bones of animals, how to set broken fingers with fish skin and ice. These lessons didn't come with songs or stories, they came in silences, in nods, in the weight of a hand resting briefly on your shoulder. Winter returned, as it always did, and with it came the slow dreams. You dreamt of forests, of wolves, running beside you not as prey or predator but as companions. You dreamt of your own voice, older and firmer, calling out in battle. Sometimes you even dreamt of the sea lifting you up like a mother's hand and carrying you toward the unknown. These dreams didn't frighten you. They made your mornings quieter, your movements more deliberate. One day, while gathering driftwood along the coast, you found something buried in the sand, An old, broken shield, its wood softened by salt and age, the iron rim rusted to near nothing. It had a small faded mark on the back, a rune, one you recognized from Astrid's stories. You didn't take it home. You sat beside it for a while, fingers trailing over the worn surface, and whispered a small vow, not to be brave, not yet, but to be ready. The sea hummed in response. There are lessons that do not come from words. They arrive in calluses, in smoke, in silence that lingers long after the embers cool. The next season of your life was shaped not by tales or driftwood dreams, but by heat and iron and sweat. It began with Einar the blacksmith, a man whose face had more soot than skin, and whose voice sounded like gravel being rolled through honey. He was not known for kindness or patience. But one morning, after you helped pull his cart from a frozen rut, he muttered, "Come by tomorrow. Bring your hands. Leave your mouth at home." And so you did. His forge was tucked near the edge of the village, beside the stream that never froze, fed by a hidden spring said to be touched by Ymir's tears. Inside, it was always warm, even when the world outside went pale with frost. You learned the rhythm of the bellows, the weight of the hammer, the color of steel when it was just right. Not orange, not yellow, but a strange and living glow, like the breath of a dragon trying not to wake. At first, your job was simple. Keep the fire fed, turn the iron rods, sweep the ash. But slowly, Einar let you do more. He'd grunt, point, nod. That was all. But it was enough. Your fingers learned how to hold a blade blank without trembling, how to strike without fear of missing. The sound of metal on metal echoed in your bones for hours after. One day, as snow still dusted the trees but the wind began to shift, he let you strike the first blow on a real sax blade. It was clumsy, too shallow. You winced, expecting his scowl. Instead, he said, "Even poor steel remembers the hammer. Just strike again." You did. Between the forge and the field, your days filled quickly. Bjorn was often absent now. His training with the village's huskarls had intensified. You saw him from time to time, sparring in the open field, moving with a looseness that betrayed how hard he practiced. He no longer waved when he saw you. But once, after dusk, you found a carved animal left outside your longhouse. A fox. Bjorn never signed his gifts. He didn't need to. Sina, ever patient, ever still as lake water, had begun learning herbcraft from the widow Gulla. You'd visit her sometimes, sitting beneath drying bundles of lavender and moss, learning the names of plants that could heal or harm. Sina would pluck petals without looking and recite their properties like a lullaby. This one soothes burns. This one is for fever dreams. This one, she'd laugh, is for making a man forget why he's angry. You collected these facts, tucking them away like bits of flint in your mind. One evening, as you cleaned Einar's forge, you heard a low moan behind the workbench. At first, you thought it was the wind, but then it came again. Painful, weak. You looked and found a cat, thin, shivering, with one leg twisted unnaturally. Without thinking, you wrapped it in your cloak and brought it to Sina. She scolded you, softly, for not knowing which root would dull pain. But she helped. You both did. It lived. You named it Varmi, for warmth. It followed you for years. That small act did something to you. You didn't feel braver. But you began to understand that strength was not loud. It didn't always shout. Sometimes it simply didn't stop. Spring returned as it always did, but this one felt different. The ice receded with less resistance. The birds sang earlier. The sea lost some of its steel color and turned, ever so slightly, toward blue. On the first day of thaw, Einar handed you a finished sax, not one you'd made, but one he'd made for you. The hilt was plain. No gems, no carvings. But when you held it, it felt like holding the promise of every quiet evening, every spark, every strike that had come before. You looked up at him. He shrugged. You'll outgrow it. But for now, keep it. You did not cry. but your breath caught like snow against fire. Word of raids began to circle through the village, whispered over shared bowls of stew and mead. Coastal settlements had been struck not far to the south. Names were spoken, some known, some not. The village elders began to meet more often. Guards walked the perimeter at night. You were not afraid, not exactly, but something in the air changed, as if the world had taken a breath and was holding it. Your mother, as always, said little, but she began laying out old garments you hadn't seen since childhood, tunics stitched with care, cloaks lined with wolf fur. She said nothing, only nodded when you asked. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, she brought you outside. The sky was a soft gray blue, the kind that comes before snow or sorrow. She pointed to the sea, to where it touched the sky. There will come a time, she said, when you must choose to follow that line, or defend what stands behind it. Either is a path of worth, but only if you walk it with both feet. You didn't understand entirely, but you nodded. You spent that evening at the forge, not working, just sitting. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that danced on the walls like old spirits. You held your sax in your lap and whispered your first true vow. I will not rush. I will not hide. I will learn until I am ready. And the fire answered with a hiss and a sigh, like it agreed. The first time you held a real sword, not one dulled by age or wrapped in linen, it felt heavier than you'd imagined. Not in weight, your arms could lift more, but in meaning. The iron seemed to hum, not with violence but with memory, as though it had known many hands before yours, each leaving behind a whisper. Your training did not begin with battle cries or shields. It began in the stillness before dawn. Ulfar, your father, had returned with little ceremony one evening as spring turned to early warmth. His face had new lines, his eyes more storm than sea. He did not ask why your hands were calloused, or why you stood taller. He only nodded once, then said, "Meet me at the edge of the clearing, tomorrow. Bring the blade." That morning was windless, the sky an unbroken sheet of pale gold. You arrived before him, waited. He came not with a sword, but with two sticks, long, smooth, and wrapped at the ends. He tossed one to you. "Today," he said, "we learn how not to die." The first few lessons were humbling, painful too. You discovered that anticipation was your worst enemy, that breath was a weapon if mistimed, that feet mattered more than hands. He struck you, gently but without apology, again and again, and each time you rose more quickly. He said little. When he did speak, it was to correct posture or to mutter the names of those he'd fought beside and what they'd done wrong. "You fight like someone who thinks," he said once. "That's good, but the blade doesn't care. It will come for you regardless." You trained in silence most days. Your body ached in ways you'd never known. Your knuckles bruised. Your calves burned. But something in you hardened. Not like stone, but like oak. Quiet, growing, rooted. Bjorn joined you occasionally. Taller now, shoulders squared, he'd grin each time you bested him. "I taught you too well," he'd say, then fall laughing into the grass. There was no envy in his tone, only pride cloaked in mischief. Once, after a session where you knocked him flat 3 times in a row, he sat up and said, "You'll make the Valkyries dizzy, you will. They'll be fighting each other over who gets to take you." You didn't know what to say to that. So you just smiled and flicked grass into his face. Summer came, and with it, change. One morning, a rider appeared, dust-covered and wide-eyed, his horse lathered with sweat. A neighboring village had been burned, not by raiders but by their own kin. Disputes over land, cattle, old grudges fed by famine. The elders gathered, voices low and grave. You watched from afar, knowing something was shifting. The sea was not the only danger now. The world was fraying at its edges. Still, life continued. You spent your days between forge and field, sparring and spinning, mending tunics and memorizing wounds. Your sax was now part of you, worn always at your side, not for show but for readiness. Your Father began teaching you how to fall. Most live or die by how well they land, he said, before sending you tumbling again. And he was right. Learning to hit the ground without breaking was a lesson few bothered to master. One evening, he took you into the woods. The trees stood like old gods, quiet and watchful. There he laid out 3 stones in a line. Each stone is a choice, he said. This one, retreat. The middle, hold your ground. The last, press forward. Every breath in battle, you're stepping on one. Most don't even realize they're choosing. You asked which one he preferred. He looked at you a long time, then said, I prefer to know which one I'm on. The lesson stayed with you. More than the drills. More than the bruises. Your mother, meanwhile, began preparing a satchel, not of food or coins, but of things you didn't understand. A folded cloth embroidered with a spiral pattern, a stone with a hole in its center, a tiny carved bear. She placed them one by one with great care, saying nothing. When you finally asked, she said, for your journey, one day you'll know what they're for. You didn't argue. But you wondered often what journey she meant. By late summer, you could run the perimeter of the village in under half an hour. You could split wood with a single swing. You could tell the sound of a blade drawn in haste from one drawn in fear. These were not the lessons of legend, but they were real, and they were yours. And still, you were not called Shieldmaiden. Not yet. The village held that title close. Reserved it for the moment of naming, the moment when one chose not just to carry a weapon, but to carry others. That moment had not come, but you were readying yourself, quietly, like a storm beyond the horizon. One night the moon was full, and the elders called a gathering. Fires were lit around the circle, songs were sung, mead flowed. You sat among them, older now, not as a child beneath the gaze of stories, but as one who had begun to write her own. Bjorn raised a toast in your name. To the quiet one who hits the hardest, he shouted. Laughter followed. But it was warm. You looked at the faces around you, the old, the young, the ones who would never sail far, and the ones already planning to leave. And you felt something. Unfamiliar settle into your chest, not pride, not fear, belonging. For the first time you realized the forge was not just where you made blades, it was where you had been made. There are moments when time seems to hold its breath, when the wind stills, the trees hush, and even the sea chooses silence. The day of your naming began like that. The sky was neither blue nor gray, but something between, washed in soft silver, like the surface of a sword left out under moonlight. It was a day that carried no storms, only a strange stillness that wrapped around the village like a woolen cloak. You were awakened before dawn by your mother. She did not speak. She handed you a bundle. Your old tunic, freshly washed, it seems mended with threads the color of lichen and ash. A simple belt, knotted thrice. And a cloak. The same wolf fur cloak you remembered from childhood winters, now adorned with a pin shaped like a small spiral. The same pattern she had embroidered months before, when you hadn't known why. When you stepped outside, you saw that the village had already begun to gather, silently, respectfully, forming a circle around the fire pit at the center. It had not been lit yet. That would wait for you. You felt your heart in your throat, not with fear, but with something deeper. A weight. A knowing. Your father stood by the edge of the circle, arms crossed. Einar was beside him, leaning slightly on the hammer he always brought, though he never used it outside the forge. Sina stood farther back, holding a bundle of herbs and fresh snow moss. Bjorn was not in sight, but you knew he'd be watching. He hated ceremonies, but never missed what mattered. Elder Ragna, tallest of the 3 who kept the old ways, stepped forward. Her hair was long and white, her staff carved with the history of your people. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. This is the naming fire, she said. It burns for no one but those who have earned their place among us, not by force, but by spirit. She turned to you. Are you ready to carry what cannot be dropped? You nodded. Are you ready to protect what is not yours? You nodded. Again. slower this time. Are you ready to walk toward the blade even when the path leads away? A pause. Then, yes. The fire was lit not with flint, but with a small braid of hair, your own, cut years ago and kept by your mother, hidden in a pouch stitched with stars. She handed it to the elder, who dropped it into the dry kindling. The fire took instantly, crackling like frost beneath boots. The ceremony was not long. No songs, no shouting. Only the slow passing of your new sayax from Einar's hands to yours. He did not smile. But he looked at you, truly looked, and said, "May it always be the second choice." That was the blacksmith's blessing. Next came the cloak, fastened by your mother with a nod that said everything and nothing. Finally, Elder Ragna stepped close and traced the spiral pin with her finger. "From this moment," she said, "you are named Shieldmaiden, not for the war you might fight, but for the peace you will carry." The villagers stepped forward one by one, not to speak, but to press something into your palm. A small stone, a carved bead, a tiny feather. These were not gifts of grandeur, but of meaning. You kept them in silence, heart full to bursting. When the ceremony ended, no one clapped. They simply returned to their lives as if the fire had always been there and you had always stood beside it. You walked out of the circle changed, not in form, but in presence. You felt taller though you were not, heavier though not in burden. It was as if the earth beneath you recognized you now. That evening, as dusk folded over the fjord, Bjorn found you sitting alone near the edge of the village. He didn't say anything at first, just dropped a round stone into your lap. It was smooth, the size of your palm, with a spiral carved deep into its center. "You forgot one," he said, grinning. "Found it by the river." You looked at him. "Did you carve this?" "Of course not," he said, then winked. "But maybe I did." You both sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge like small fires in the sky. The sea whispered, below, never far, never silent. "I suppose now you'll be too important to spar with me," he said eventually. You nudged his shoulder. "You've always been better with your mouth than your hands." "That's because my hands are busy crafting legends," he replied, with mock solemnity, "and roasting fish." You laughed, a real laugh, one that rose from your chest like steam from morning bread. That night you couldn't sleep, not from excitement, but from a calm too large to rest beneath. You sat near your longhouse fire, tracing the lines of your sayax, whispering the names of those who had walked before you. Freydis, Ragna, Astrid, and the silver-haired warrior whose scar had once shone like a promise. You understood now. The naming was not about proving yourself, it was about accepting that the proving would never end. And that somehow was comforting. Outside, the stars blinked softly. The fire cracked. And you, Shieldmaiden now, rested not because the journey was over, but because it had truly begun. For weeks after the naming, life returned to its gentle rhythm. Morning mists clinging to the fields, the smell of peat smoke curling through the village, the call of gulls circling above like loose threads in the sky. But something inside you had shifted, and though your hands continued with their work, turning soil, mending nets, braiding rope, your thoughts wandered like driftwood carried out beyond the bay. You were Shieldmaiden now. The word was yours, worn not like armor but like breath. And yet nothing had changed, at least not outwardly. The goat still needed feeding. The longhouse still creaked in the night. Your mother still reminded you to patch your sleeves before they tore wider. And yet within you a quiet current had begun to form, not a longing, not quite, but a listening. You began to walk the shore more often, sometimes before dawn, when the tide whispered secrets only the moon could understand. Other times you wandered in the blue hush of evening, toes in the sand, your cloak wrapped tightly as the breeze tugged like a child asking questions you didn't yet know how to answer. One such evening, you met the boatwright, Haldor. He was an old man whose beard tangled with sawdust and whose fingers bore the shape of 1,000 hulls. He rarely spoke, preferring the company of cedar planks and tar, but he watched you carefully as you traced the edge of a half-finished prow with your fingertips. "Looks out instead of in," he said suddenly without turning. You looked at him, unsure. "The bow," he clarified, nodding toward the ship. "Some boats are made for rivers, others for seas. This one, it's meant to leave." You didn't respond, but something, in his words, struck true. You helped him after that, just occasionally, passing tools, lifting beams, brushing off shavings. He said little, but your presence seemed welcome. You watched as he bent wood like time, steaming and shaping it until even the hardest boards curved willingly. "You can't fight the grain," he told you once. "Best to learn it, work with it." You thought of your own path, how it had curved, slowly, gently, from child to Shieldmaiden, not through force, but through listening, through waiting. That spring, the first trader ship arrived earlier than usual. A sleek vessel painted in bright dyes, its sail stitched with a serpent coiled around the moon. The crew disembarked with wide smiles and heavy sacks, carrying goods from distant shores, amber from the Baltic, salt from the south, carved bone from the Sami lands. With them came stories, as always. One of the traders, a woman with a scar across her neck and laughter like warm cider, told of a distant land where the trees bled sap so sweet birds grew drunk on it. Another spoke of a king who had outlawed wolves only to be overrun by deer and regret. These tales were offered like bread, torn, and passed freely around the fire. You listened more than you spoke, but your heart stirred. That night, you lay awake, staring at the rafters of your longhouse, the flickering firelight painting shapes across the wood. You imagined the sail lifting above you, the horizon unspooling like yarn, and yet you did not leave. Not yet. Instead, you turned inward. You trained more frequently now, not with your father. He had grown quieter, his gaze often toward the sea. But with yourself. You set challenges, running the trail up to the ridge before the sun rose fully, practicing forms in the meadow until the crows no longer startled. You drilled until sweat soaked your back and your muscles ached not with pain but memory. Einar noticed. He didn't say much, just handed you a whetstone one morning and said, "The edge remembers." Sina, ever perceptive, asked one evening, as you braided wild mint into bundles, "Are you waiting for something or someone?" You paused, fingers mid-loop. "I think," you said slowly, "I'm listening." She nodded. Listening takes more strength than people know. Bjorn had begun training farther from the village now. He spoke of joining a coastal guard, of seeing the islands past the southern fjords. "There's a place where the stars are mirrored in the lake," he told you once, eyes wide. "So perfectly that you forget which way is up." You smiled but didn't answer. His dreams were wind. Yours were tide. The stillness of those days was not boring. It was full of whispers, of preparation, of quiet growth like moss upon stone. The village pulsed with its usual rhythm, births, harvests, repairs. But inside you, something larger stirred. One morning, while collecting driftwood after a storm, you found a shard of dark glass wedged between rocks, smooth as river stone, sharp as memory. It looked like something born of fire and pressure. You kept it in your pouch, running your fingers over it whenever your thoughts turned distant. And they turned often. That summer passed without incident, without battle. Some might call it dull, but you knew better. It was a season of becoming, a time to steep like tea, to settle like sand after wind. You began to write in your own way, etching small marks into driftwood, symbols that meant nothing to others but held weight for you. A storm, a promise, a choice. You'd leave them on the shore, offering them to the tide, not asking, just sharing. On the last night before the harvest moon, you stood again on the cliffs above the village, the wind cool on your face, the stars sharp and near. You whispered, "I am ready." But still nothing changed, and that too was its own kind of magic. Change does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes as a change in the wind, a single gust from a new direction, carrying scents you haven't smelled since childhood, or whispers that don't belong to your village. That morning began with such a wind. It rustled the birch trees behind the longhouse, set the smoke curling eastward instead of west, and carried with it a faint trace of pine and distant salt. You paused mid-step on your way to the forge, the breeze brushing, your cheeks like the memory of a hand. By the time you reached Einar's workshop, the wind had stirred the coals before you did. He looked up from his work, narrowed his eyes toward the sky and muttered, "Old gods are stretching." You weren't sure what that meant, but you repeated it to yourself later as you sharpened your blade. Around the village, people began to notice other small shifts. The crows cawed louder. The goats grew restless. The fishermen said the sea had changed, still calm, but in a way that felt more like silence before speech. You listened, not to what was said aloud, but to what was not. Your father took to walking along the cliffs in the late afternoon, something he hadn't done in years. He didn't speak of it. You didn't ask. And still, the days passed as they always had. You helped gather berries for the winter stores, your fingers stained red and purple. You helped Sina dry herbs until her little hut smelled like a forest's breath. Bjorn returned briefly, boasting of a skirmish that had ended before it began. Just some shouting and a goat that ran off with someone's sword. You laughed with him, but even he seemed more watchful than before. One evening, as you sat near the edge of the village, turning your sayak slowly in the fading light, Elder Ragna joined you. She sat without invitation, as elders do. "The wind carries news," she said. You nodded, but you already feel that, don't you? You looked at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know what I feel." "Good," she said. "It means you're not making up stories to explain it." You waited. She plucked a small sprig of yarrow from her pouch and rolled it between her fingers. "Something stirring beyond the fjords," she said. "Not a threat, not yet, but a ripple, one that may reach our shores." "Raiders?" you asked. "Not the kind that shout and swing axes," she replied. "The other kind. The ones that come with offers and smiles and maps." You frowned. She looked at you, then smiled faintly. "Don't worry, child. I'm not here to scare you. I just wanted to see how you listen." You thought of the sea, the stories, the silence. "I listen," you said softly. "I know," she said, standing. "That's why I came." She left you with the yarrow sprig. You kept it. The next few days passed in a strange quiet. The village prepared for the harvest festival, a time of feasting, stories, and honoring those who had passed into legend. You helped build the bonfire stack, your arms full of branches and your sleeves dusted with dry moss. At night, the stars seemed sharper, closer, as if leaning in. Then came the ship. It arrived at dawn, just as the mist was lifting off the water, a long, low vessel painted in green and blue, with sails like bird wings. It moved without urgency, gliding into the cove as if it had always known the way. No shouts, no drums, just the creak of wood and the hiss of tide against hull. The villagers gathered quickly, eyes wary, hands near blades. But the crew that stepped off were not raiders. They wore cloaks of gray, carried no visible weapons, and spoke with accents that twisted familiar words into curious forms. Their leader, a man with dark braids and silver rings on every finger, introduced himself simply. "We are traders," he said, "but also listeners." That last word lingered strangely. They brought goods, yes. Fine cloth, cured spices, thin scrolls of inked vellum. But they also brought questions. What lies beyond your hills? Who speaks for your shoreline? What do your dreams look like? Elder Ragna spoke with them. So did your father, and a few others. You watched, unsure. Later that evening, as the villagers gathered for quiet discussion, Sina leaned toward you. "They're not just traders," she whispered. You nodded. "They're mapping." "For what?" she asked. You had no answer. That night, your dreams were filled with spirals. You stood on a path made of stone, each step marked by firelight. The wind carried voices not your own, and in the distance you saw a sail, huge, golden, shimmering. But every time you tried to walk toward it, the path shifted. You awoke before dawn, breath steady but deep, like the sea pulling tide. You stepped outside, looked at the gray edge of morning and whispered, "Soon," and the wind, always listening, shifted again. The traders stayed longer than anyone expected, not long enough to claim worry, but just long enough to unsettle the rhythm of the village, like a stone placed in the flow of a stream. Not disruptive, just noticeable. Their ship, with its serpent-painted hull and quiet crew, remained moored in the bay. Its sail was furled, but every so often someone would catch a glimpse of it unfurled at dusk, casting strange shadows against the rocks, as if reminding the shore that the sea always remembers. You kept your distance at first, but curiosity, like tide, has a way of wearing down even the firmest of shores. On the third morning, as dew still clung to the heather, you wandered near the edge of their camp.
One of them, a woman with skin like sun-worn parchment and hair tied in tight knots, looked up from a scroll she was etching. "You watch with your whole face," she said, not unkindly. You blinked. "Is that wrong?" "No," she smiled.
Just rare. Her name was Elira. She was a cartographer, or so she claimed, but not of roads or rivers. Her maps, she explained, were of choices. Every village, every person, leaves a shape, she said. Not one you can always see with eyes, but it's there. Woven through decision, tradition, silence, I traced the threads. You frowned, trying to imagine how silence could be drawn. She unrolled a piece of vellum. It looked like a maze, but softer. Spirals, lines, loops that connected and bent and rejoined. At its center, a single dot. Dark, small, but bold. "This is your village," she said. "And this," she tapped the spiral around it, "is its hesitation." You weren't sure whether to be offended or intrigued. She read your expression and smiled. Hesitation is not weakness. It's potential still in motion. Later, you told Sina about it. She raised an eyebrow. "What kind of trader talks? Like a philosopher?" "The kind that draws what can't be seen," you answered. That night, the village held council. Not a formal one, but the kind that forms naturally. Voices rising over firelight. Opinions woven like blankets between bites of roasted fish. Some wanted the traders gone. "They ask too many questions," muttered old Thorgils. "No good. Ever came from men who carry ink instead of steel." Others were curious. "They offered amber for dried seaweed," said Rhoda, the fishwife. "And their jars of salt, like white fire." Your father said little. He watched the fire with narrowed eyes, his mouth set like an old scar. "They will leave when they're ready," he said finally. "But we must be ready too." You wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his tone said not yet. The days that followed were quiet again, but not the peaceful kind. A pause had settled, one filled with thought. You returned to your routines, sword practice, herb drying, wood splitting, but each task now echoed with questions. Were you learning to defend something that might soon be changed, or preparing to carry it forward? One afternoon, Elira approached you again. She carried a different scroll this time, shorter, thicker, stained slightly with berry juice. "Not all maps lead away," she said. You took the scroll, unrolled it. It showed the coastline, not just your own, but a sweep of fjords and inlets, each marked with symbols. Some you recognized, others not at all. She pointed to a mark near the top. "This one's yours. And the others?" "Places like yours," she said. "Or places that once were." You looked at the scroll, at the spaces in between. "Why? Show me this?" you asked. She shrugged. "Because you listen like someone who might one day walk beyond it." You didn't respond, but you kept the scroll. Later that week, as you sparred with Bjorn near the cliffs, you found yourself distracted. His wooden blade caught you in the shoulder, not hard but enough to jolt you. "Your mind's not here," he said, stepping back. You rubbed your arm. "It's stretched. He tilted his head. Sea dreams again? You nodded. He didn't. Tease. He sat beside you in the grass. You know, he said, my grandfather used to say the sea doesn't take you. It just reminds you you're not a tree. You laughed. And your grandfather also believed goats could read runes. Still, he smiled. He wasn't wrong. That evening, you stood at the shore as the sun dipped below the horizon. The trader ship's hull caught the light, shimmering like an old coin. You thought of Elira's map, of spirals, of choices, and for the first time, you whispered a question not out of fear, but invitation. What would I find if I left? The sea, as always, said nothing. But the wind shifted ever so slightly toward the south. The morning after the traders departed, the village felt heavier, not in sorrow, not in fear, but in quiet. As if something had been spoken but never heard, and now everyone waited for the echo. Their ship had sailed at dawn, silent, almost reverent. No drums, no waves cut in anger, just a glide across the still water, as if the sea itself agreed with their departure. You stood on the shore, watching the horizon long after their sail vanished. In your hand, the scroll Elira had given you felt warm, though the air was cool. You hadn't shown it to anyone, not even Sina. Some knowledge you felt needed time to ripen in silence. The days that followed returned to routine, but that routine was subtly changed, as though someone had rearranged the furniture in your mind. You still practiced daily, the edge of your blade whispering against straw dummies. You still helped at the forge, where Einar now had you fitting small iron rivets with a precision he once reserved only for his own hands. You still joined Sina in her herb sorting, and laughed when Bjorn tried to make pine resin explode in the fire. But everything now bore a question mark at its edge. Not because you doubted the village, but because you wondered what it would ask of you now that the world had grown larger. One afternoon, your mother caught you staring out the window, something you did more often now. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside you and began sorting wool, her hands working rhythmically. I used to watch the sea too, she said quietly. When I was your age. You turned to her. Did you want to leave? Sometimes, she admitted. But I was, never certain whether I wanted to see new places, or just to see myself somewhere else. You understood that more than you expected. She paused in her work, smoothing a curl of wool between her fingers. The sea gives, but it also takes, she said, and not always what you expect. You nodded. I'm not sure what I want to give it. Then wait, she said. The sea's not going anywhere. That evening, you joined your father for a walk along the cliffs, a tradition long dormant, now quietly revived. He said little, as always, but his silence was different now. Not distant, just full. He carried a staff he hadn't used before, a carved one, with iron rings down its side. You hadn't noticed it until now. When you asked, he simply said, "It's old." You both watched the tide roll in, the wind soft and steady. Finally, he said, "You've been marked by something." You glanced at him, startled. "Not cursed," he added. "Not blessed either, just named, not by the village, by yourself." You weren't sure how to answer that, so you didn't. He turned to you. "There's strength in leaving," he said, "but there's strength in staying too, in knowing every tree by name, in walking a path not because it's new, but because it needs walking." He tapped the ground with his staff. "You don't always need a ship to go far." Later that night, you found the spiral stone Bjorn had given you, still tucked in your pouch with the scroll. You traced its curves with your thumb, thinking not of places but of paths. What if leaving wasn't the only journey? What if becoming wasn't about where you went, but how you remained? The next day, the village held its autumn blessing, a ritual to mark the last good harvest before winter. Bundles of herbs were burned, bread was shared, stories were told. You stood beside your mother as she lit the small ceremonial fire outside your longhouse. The smoke curled upward, and for a moment, you imagined it forming the shape of Elira's spiraled map, just for an instant. Later, children ran through the fields with colored ribbons, laughter trailing like birdsong. Bjorn helped hoist barrels for the mead hall, grumbling loudly for effect. Sina played a bone flute by the hearth, a tune so soft it sounded like wind moving through grass. You danced, not with flair but with ease, your feet moving not to impress but to remember, each step a thread in something older than yourself. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars pressed close, you sat alone and opened the scroll again. This time, you didn't look at the paths or the dots. You looked at the space between them. And in that quiet, you understood something. You were not stuck. You were still choosing. And every morning you stayed, every sparring match, every herb gathered, every wound mended. That too was movement. That too was a kind of travel. You rolled up the scroll, and for the first time in days you slept deeply, not because nothing awaited you, but because what awaited could wait a little longer. The first frost came quietly, slipping over the land like a sigh at the end of a long conversation. It dusted the fields in pale silver, left spiderwebs suspended like lace across fence posts, and turned puddles into thin panes of ice that cracked under careless boots. The village, ever responsive to the breath of the seasons, moved inward. Longhouses sealed tighter, cloaks pulled higher, songs sung lower and nearer to the hearth. You awoke that morning to the familiar scent of wood smoke and the sound of your mother stirring porridge in the pot. Her breath clouded the air in front of her face, but she hummed a summer tune nonetheless. You smiled to yourself. She never let the cold rewrite her rhythms. Outside, the world was slow. Not sleepy, not dead, just deliberate. Even the chickens walked differently, their feet unsure on the frozen earth. You spent much of that day gathering kindling with Sina, her cheeks red from the wind, her arms full of split birch branches. The two of you didn't speak much. You didn't need to. Your silences had become comfortable, like thick blankets layered over thoughts that didn't need words to be shared. Later, as you stacked the last of the wood beside the longhouse, you paused and listened. No wind, no gulls. Just the faint crackling of fires in nearby homes. "Do you ever feel," Sina said, breaking the stillness, "like everything is waiting for something?" You nodded slowly, like breath being held. She looked toward the tree line. "But we don't know what for." "No," you agreed. "Not yet." That evening, Elder Ragna summoned a small group to the circle. Just the Shieldmaidens, a few of the younger warriors, and two of the older farmers. You hadn't gathered like this since the last training season ended. She stood beside the fire, her staff resting against a worn stone, and waited until the hush settled fully. "There's a storm coming," she said. Not wind, not snow, but something that rides the edge of silence. The others listened with furrowed brows. She continued, "It may pass us by, or it may ask for a decision." She looked at you when she said that last part, and you felt your spine straighten. No one asked what she meant. The old ways didn't always come with explanations. Afterward, Bjorn joined you at the edge of the field where the grass had frozen stiff and pale. "Do you think she means war?" he asked, toeing the frost with his boot. "Or change?" You said, "Same thing sometimes." You both stood there a while, watching the stars emerge slowly, each one a cold eye blinking open in the vast dark. He nudged your shoulder. "If the storm does come, I hope we're in it together." You nodded. "I'd rather be cold beside you than warm in hiding," he added with a crooked grin. You rolled your eyes. But you smiled. In the days that followed, you found yourself more often with the elders. Asked to help mend gear, to deliver messages, to assist in reading the old runes carved on forgotten stones near the southern hills. Your role was shifting. Not grandly, not suddenly, but steadily. You weren't just a Shieldmaiden now. You were a keeper of rhythm, a carrier of memory. And with that came new weight. Einar, too, seemed to sense it. One afternoon, while you polished a row of axes for sharpening, he handed you a new hilt, unfinished, unshaped. "Make it yours," he said. You looked at him. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That night, as the fire cracked and hissed in your longhouse, you studied the hilt. It was plain, just a block of dark wood and a strip of twisted iron. But your hands itched to shape it. Your father watched from the shadows. "You've been quieter," he said. "Listening," you replied. He nodded. "Good. But don't forget to speak when it matters." You looked up. He met your gaze. Silence is not always wisdom. That stayed with you. The next morning, you walked the ridge trail before the sun had fully risen. Frost bit your boots and your breath curled like runes into the pale air. At the top, you unrolled Elira's scroll again. This time, you traced the spiral slowly, letting your thoughts move with your finger. And when you reached the center, the bold little dot, you whispered to it, "I am not waiting. I am preparing." The wind didn't answer, but the sun rose anyway, soft and pink, casting long shadows that looked, just for a moment, like sails. It was a thin line at first, just a smudge across the treetops, faint and far, like a streak of charcoal drawn by an uncertain hand. You noticed it during your morning patrol along the eastern ridge, your breath fogging the air in small clouds, your sayax at your hip and your eyes sharp from the cold. The sky was the pale gray of unwashed wool, and the air was still enough that even the snow-laden branches didn't creak. But the smoke was there, not the thick, rolling kind that spoke of war or wildfire. This was finer, subtle, steady. You narrowed your eyes and marked the direction. It wasn't close, at least not yet. But it wasn't the usual smoke from hearths or fields either. This was the sort that didn't belong to routine. You returned to the village without urgency, but your pace was firm. Along the way, you passed Sina, who was laying ice-cracked herbs out to dry near her window. She looked up. "Something?" You hesitated, then nodded. "Smoke. East." She didn't ask more. Just stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, and followed. You reported it to your father first. He was carving thin strips of leather for bindings, the kind used for holding shields together or securing travel gear. He listened without looking up, but you saw his hands pause for the briefest moment. "Which ridge?" "Beyond the old stag path," you said. That told him everything. He set down his knife and stood slowly, stretching his shoulders. "Not wild land. That's settled land." You both knew what that could mean. Later that day, the village elders met, not in alarm, but in shared attention. No bell was rung, no horns blown, but messages passed like whispers through a loom, each one steady, each one purposeful. A party would be sent. Small, silent, watching only. You volunteered and no one was surprised. Bjorn was already packing when you arrived at the gathering hall. He had his long knife, his hunting boots, and a look on his face that said he'd hoped for this. 3 days, said Elder Ragna. In and out, no banners, no blades drawn unless drawn first. Your father gave you a nod as you left. Not proud, not afraid, just knowing. The first night on the trail was colder than expected. The frost crept over your bedroll like vines. Bjorn offered you a blanket he claimed was woven from sheep with fire in their bellies. You declined, but smiled. The next day, the smoke was closer. You didn't speak much, only the occasional signal. A nod, a gesture, the crunch of ice beneath your boots louder than any words might have been. By late afternoon, you crested a ridge and saw it clearly. A village, but not as it should be. The smoke rose not from cook fires, but from rubble. Roofs sagged, walls were blackened. One longhouse had collapsed entirely, the timbers splayed like broken ribs. No movement, no voices, only the slow waver of heat above charred earth. You and Bjorn stayed low, hidden among the trees. After a while, you descended carefully. Circling wide, there were no bodies, no blood, just silence. It was not raided. It was abandoned or evacuated. You found tracks leading north, many feet hurried but not chaotic, as if the villagers had left in haste but not in terror. Bjorn crouched beside a broken fence and ran his fingers along the burnt edges. "This was no accident," he said. You nodded. The burn lines were too clean, deliberate. Inside one half-collapsed hut, you found symbols drawn in ash on the floor. Circles, triangles, a spiral, not unlike the one from Elira's map. Your fingers brushed it lightly. Still warm. You didn't speak of it that night when you set camp under the bare pines. Instead, you lay awake, watching your breath rise to meet the stars. What had driven them away? What had burned their homes but not their dead? What did the spiral mean now, so far from ink and vellum? You returned to your own village on the third day, as planned. You gave your report. The elders listened. No conclusions were drawn. But the fire pits burned longer that night. And more guards walked the perimeter. You kept the ash-marked stone you found. Sina cleaned it, tucked it among her bundles, and said only, "We are being watched." And she was right. But not in the way you feared. The watching was not with malice. Was with expectation. As if the world itself had turned a page and now waited to see how you would read the next line. Ash clings longer than you'd think. Even after wind and water, even after washing and time, the smell of it lingers. In the seams of your cloak, in the grooves of your boots, in the hollow behind your heart. You dreamed of it that night. Not flames, not fear. Just silence, thick and patient like the inside of a cave. In the dream, you stood in the center of the burned village. But now it was whole. Roofs intact, doorways warm with lantern light. Smoke rose gently from chimneys. Laughter echoed down empty alleys. But when you reached out to knock on a door, your hand passed through the wood like mist. And then you were alone again. You woke before dawn, the coals in the hearth still glowing faintly. Sina sat nearby, stirring, something fragrant in a small pot. She glanced at you, and you didn't have to speak. She already knew. "There's something in the bones of that place," she murmured. "Not ghosts, not spirits. Just wait." You nodded. Outside, frost touched every surface like a delicate warning. That morning, Elder Ragna asked you to accompany her to the old stone ring, an ancient circle near the cliff's edge, where the wind never stopped speaking. You hadn't been there since your naming. She walked slowly, leaning more heavily than usual on her staff. You didn't offer to help. She would ask if she needed it. When you reached the ring, she stood in the center and turned her face to the sea. "The world is thickening," she said. You waited. "There's an old story," she continued, her voice barely louder than the waves, "of a tree that remembered everything it saw. It grew in the middle of a village, silent, unmoving. When the people left, the tree remained. Years later, someone returned. They touched its bark and remembered everything." You didn't interrupt. She finally turned to you. "We do not remember for ourselves," she said. "We remember for those who cannot return." You thought of the spiral, of Elira, of the scroll still hidden in your satchel. Then she placed something in your hand, a shard of bone, polished and marked with a single rune. "Ansus." "For listening," she said, "and speaking." You tucked it into your pouch without a word. Over the next few days, the village grew quieter, not out of fear, but readiness. The forge rang more often. Rope was checked. Sleds were brought out and inspected. Children were told older stories, of wolves who spoke riddles, of stars that fell and became wells, of ships that never returned but always sent dreams ahead of them. You continued training, not with greater urgency but with deeper attention. You moved slower, breathed fuller, sparred with less noise and more purpose. Your father watched now and then from beneath the eaves. Einar handed you a wrapped bundle one afternoon. Inside was the hilt you had shaped weeks before, now fitted, with a blade, Short, slightly curved, etched with the faint pattern of waves. "Your second," he said simply. "Not because the first is broken, but because you are more than one name now. You carried it beside your sayax." That evening, Sina brought out the spiral stone again. She'd polished it further, and now you could see a faint shimmer beneath the soot. She set it between you. "What do you think it means?" she asked softly. You shook your head. "I think it's asking." "Asking what?" "What we'll do with the silence it left behind." You looked up at the stars, clearer now, sharper. The kind of night where breath sounds louder and footsteps feel like they might echo forever. That night you wrote your first letter. Not to anyone. Not to be sent, just to be said. You carved it into a thin sheet of driftwood, smoothed by tide and time. A single line. "I am not afraid to wait, but I am ready to answer." You placed it by the stream near the forest's edge, tucked among reeds. The next morning it was gone. The frost was heavier the next few days. One morning you woke to find the stream frozen solid. A fox had left prints across the bridge. Signa said it was a good omen. Bjorn said it was probably looking for his forgotten lunch. You smiled, but your thoughts were elsewhere. A week passed, then two. No new smoke, no visitors. Just winter deepening, snow piling, hearths burning steadily. But the stillness was different now, not empty. Expectant. You could feel it in your bones, like when the first string of a song is plucked and hangs in the air before the rest join in, and you knew somehow that you would not always be watching. Soon you would be walking, not away, but toward. Winter settled in fully then. It did not crash upon you like a wave or strike like a blade. It arrived as breath, slow and persistent, until every corner of the village held its weight. Snow piled softly, reshaping rooftops into curves. Trees grew silent beneath white cloaks. The stream, once murmuring through the village edge, fell mute under layers of ice. The days grew short and blue, the nights long and silver. And with each passing morning, you became more aware of the stillness between things. Between steps on the path, between words spoken at the hearth, between breaths as you watched your blade's edge catch firelight. It was in these quiet spaces that the weight of waiting truly made itself known. You weren't alone in feeling it. The village adjusted as all wise places do. Patterns tightened. The work grew slower, more careful. People began to speak of time as though it had grown thick, like honey in the cold. Sina's hands were always busy, plucking dried herbs from rafters, layering salves into small pots. But even she, steady as moss on stone, grew quieter. Bjorn, never one to sit still, began carving small figurines. They were crude at first, odd animals, twisted faces, but gradually they took on form, precision, almost personality. He gave you one shaped like a horse with too many teeth. "To keep nightmares away," he said with a grin, "or at least confuse them." You kept it by your bed. Your own work became slower, more inward. You returned often to the stone ring, standing alone beneath the open sky. The snow there lay undisturbed even by deer, as if the land knew some places were not meant to be tracked. Once you found Elder Ragna already there, brushing snow from one of the ancient stones. "It listens more when it's cold," she said. You asked, "The land?" She nodded. "The world." She crouched beside a half-buried spiral carved into the rock, her fingers bare despite the chill. "When we walk, we leave heat behind," she whispered. "The earth remembers warmth longer." Then footsteps. You stayed with her until the stars appeared, watching breath coil and vanish. That night you dreamed again. This time, you were in a long hall, larger than any in the village. Its walls pulsed with faint light, like frost reflecting moonlight. In your hand you carried no blade, only the scroll Elira had given you. But it was open now and glowing, and on it a new line had appeared, a path drawn from the center outward, like a thread waiting to be followed. You woke with the sense that something had begun, even if it hadn't arrived yet. Still, no word came. No new smoke. No returning ships. No fresh tracks in the woods. Only the growing quiet. And so, you worked. You rewove the hem of your cloak with threads dipped in crushed pine bark, a tradition your mother taught you for endurance. You practiced your sword form slower, as if the motion itself were the purpose, not the result. You reread old runes, even those whose meanings had blurred into metaphor. You carved another message, this time into a piece of driftwood shaped like a feather. I have not forgotten. You left it near the frozen stream. 3 days later, it was gone again. One morning, while carrying salt to the storage cellar, you found a scrap of dark wool caught on a splintered post near the village edge. It was nothing unusual, could have come from any number of cloaks. But something about the texture made you pause. It was coarser than local weave, and beneath it, in the snow, a faint line, not a footprint, but the drag of something heavy being pulled. You called Bjorn. Together you followed the trail into the woods. It didn't go far. Just beyond the tree line it stopped entirely, as if the snow had simply refused to remember. Bjorn knelt, running his fingers through the last mark. "Do you think we were meant to find it?" he asked. "I don't think it matters," you said. "Why not?" "Because we have." You returned with the wool scrap and gave it to Sina. She sniffed it, then tasted it briefly at the edge. An old herbalist's trick. "Dyed with iron root," she said. "Not local." That night, as the wind pressed against the longhouse walls and the fire crackled low, you sat with the scroll again. This time, you didn't trace the spiral. You just looked at it and waited. You weren't restless anymore. Not like before. Now, your waiting had form, substance. It was no longer a pause. It was preparation. In the long silence between footsteps, you had begun to hear something else entirely. Not emptiness, but readiness. It began not with a shout, nor a horn, nor the sudden break of snow. It began instead with a sound almost too small to matter. Drip. A single drop, falling from the edge of your longhouse roof onto the packed, frozen earth. You didn't hear it the first morning, nor did anyone else. The village was still deep in its winter rituals, wrapping cloaks tighter, waking slowly, and letting the fire do most of the talking. But the second morning, it returned, and the third. And by the fourth, the drip had become a rhythm. It echoed faintly through the silence, a gentle knock at the door of the season. Melt water. Spring was not here, not yet, but it had sent its messenger ahead. You awoke earlier that day than usual, before the sky had fully shaken off the stars. The fire in the hearth still glowed softly, low and sleepy. Your breath made clouds in the air, but the edges of your blanket no longer felt frozen. Outside, the world remained blanketed in white, but not untouched. The snow held a sheen now, as if it had begun to sweat. Icicles hung thinner than the week before. Tracks made by birds lingered longer. You wrapped your cloak around your shoulders, fastened your blade at your hip more by habit than intention, and stepped out into the hush. Everything sounded different, not louder, just softer in a new way, like the trees had changed what they were listening for. You walked beyond the village edge toward the stream. It had been silent for months now, locked beneath layers of snow and ice. But today, something moved beneath it. You could hear it, faint, shy, but present. A trickle, a whisper, a thread of water slipping through the ice's grip. And there, caught between two roots half buried in frost, was something else. You knelt, a strip of cloth, no wider than your palm, woven with blue and gray thread. Frayed, at the edges soaked but not ruined, you pulled it free gently. Upon one side a stitched symbol, simple, small, and unmistakable. A spiral. Not the same as Elira's, not exactly. But close. Close enough to raise every hair on your arms. You sat there for a long time, letting the cloth rest across your knees, listening to the water, letting it speak in its own quiet language. Sina found you there after the sun had risen, her boots crunching gently on the frost. She didn't ask what you were doing, she simply sat beside you. You handed her the cloth. She turned it over slowly in her hands. "I think the earth is remembering again," she whispered. You nodded. "Do you think this is for us?" she asked. "I don't know," you replied. "But I think we're supposed to find it." That afternoon, you showed it to Elder Ragna. She held it to the light, turning it slowly, then held it to her ear. Not out of superstition, but out of habit. "There's nothing louder than a quiet message," she murmured. "And this is quiet enough to carry weight." She handed it back to you. "Keep listening," she said. Back in the longhouse, your mother glanced at it only briefly before returning to her stitching, but her eyes lingered a heartbeat, longer than usual. Later that evening, Bjorn found you near the edge of the woods. He had mud on his boots and a satchel over his shoulder. He grinned as always, but it was tempered now. Like the grin was keeping something heavier from slipping out. "I saw birds flying north," he said. "Too soon? Or maybe right on time." You sat together in the melting snow, watching clouds drift above the tree line. Bjorn handed you something from his satchel, a small token wrapped in cloth. Inside, a stone, smooth and flat, with a hole through the middle. "A hagstone. For looking through," he said. "They say it shows what's hidden." You held it up to your eye. Through the hole, the world didn't look different, but it did feel more patient. That night, you added the spiral cloth to your pouch, beside the first spiral stone and the carved piece of driftwood you had saved from autumn. You looked at them all and whispered softly, "I'm still listening." You dreamed of the stream that night, no longer frozen, but rushing. A voice moved. With it, though, you couldn't understand the words, only the cadence, gentle, repetitive, calling not out but inward. You awoke just before dawn. Snow was still on the ground, but the air no longer tasted like silence. It tasted like waiting turned into invitation. Paths rarely begin with certainty. They do not announce themselves nor draw clear lines in the soil. They do not beckon with banners or fanfare. They begin quietly, beneath the surface, beneath the snow, beneath the skin. Yours began as a lean of instinct, a soft tilt of attention towards something you couldn't name but could no longer ignore. The first sign was small, just a patch of exposed earth where the snow had melted more quickly than elsewhere, beneath the tree you used to climb as a child. Its roots curved like sleeping fingers, and now, where frost had clung all winter, moss had begun to reappear. You crouched there for a while, running your hand along the soft green. It smelled of beginnings. That week, the thaw continued. Water trickled under the ice. Birds began to argue over nesting places in the thatched roofs. Even the wind shifted. No longer sharp but curious, like it wanted to know what you might do next. Each day you felt your steps grow lighter. The stillness of winter had shaped you, not just in body, but in patience, in attention. But now, the world was loosening its hold. You spent a morning with Einar at the forge, reshaping a blade left too long in storage. He gave it to you without explanation. Its hilt was worn, but the steel held a line that caught light like memory. "Nothing forgotten," he said. "Ever stays dull forever." You nodded. Afterward, you visited Sina, who was boiling dried willow bark into a thick, bitter-smelling syrup. "For the joints," she said. "The cold leaves reminders in the bones." You stirred the pot with her side by side. She didn't ask where your mind had been lately. She didn't need to. She simply handed you a cloth-wrapped bundle before you left. "For wherever," she said. Inside, a small jar of salve, a strip of dried mint, and a coin with a hole through the center. Bjorn caught up with you at the edge of the village the next evening. He was barefoot, walking across the melting snow as if testing its surrender. He didn't speak at first, just walked beside you, hands clasped behind his back. Finally, he said, "They say when the path appears, you won't recognize it at first. Why? Because it'll look like your own footprints." You thought, about that. Maybe all journeys are echoes of what we already know, just walked in a wider circle. That night you sat by the fire in your longhouse and studied the spiral cloth again. Its threads were fraying slightly at the edges, but the symbol remained clear. You placed it beside your blade and stared at them both. Neither asked for anything, and yet you understood them both as invitations. The next morning you returned to the ridge. The view had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Where once there had been only snow, there were now hints of color. Brown earth, green needles, the shimmer of meltwater catching sun. The old path, the one you walked often as a child chasing after goats or dreams, had begun to reappear. Not in full, but in pieces. You followed it. The woods beyond were quiet, not with the stillness of winter, but the hush of watching. Every twig beneath your feet snapped louder than expected. Every gust of wind brought the faint smell of pine sap and turned soil. And then, on a flat stone near a bend in the trail, you saw it. A spiral, not etched, not stitched, but drawn in melted ash, ringed with last autumn's leaves. It was fading, but it had been recent. You sat beside it and placed your hand on the stone. The warmth from the sun had barely touched it, but the spiral's presence pulsed faintly beneath your palm. You closed your eyes. No message came. No thunder. No prophecy. Just the slow, steady truth. You were not waiting for permission. You were not lost. You were already walking the path. Later that day, you began to gather what you would need, not out of rush, but rhythm. You cleaned your blades, packed salves and dried food, wrapped the spiral cloth around your water skin. You didn't tell anyone yet, not even your mother, but she noticed. That evening, as you returned to the longhouse, she handed you your old gloves, mended at the fingertips, lined with fur. "You'll want these," she said simply. And that was all. That night, you dreamed again of the plain, the one with the stone circles and invisible threads. But this time, you didn't stand still. You took a step, and the stones did not vanish. They nodded. When you awoke, your boots were by the door, and the sky was clear, and the snow, at last, was no longer winning. The morning you left came without ceremony. No bells rang, no horns blew. The village stirred behind you in its usual rhythm. Fires being lit, animals fed, the slow shuffle of boots over thawing ground. You stood at the edge of the northern trail, cloak fastened, pack secured, blades checked twice over. Only your mother and Sina stood beside you. Your mother handed you a small pouch, soft and light. "For sweetness," she said. Inside were sugared berries from last summer, dried and wrapped in waxed cloth. Sina gave you a small bundle of herbs, bound with red thread. "Burn this when you're alone," she said, "but not because you're afraid. Because you want to. Remember, you hugged them both, your mother wordlessly, her breath catching against your shoulder, and Sina tightly, her hands cold but steady. Bjorn had already gone ahead. He'd left just before first light, as he often did when things felt too heavy to hold with words. He said he'd meet you where the old trail forked, where the stones began to change shape. You took your first step alone, and the land, to its credit, didn't demand anything from you. The path curved gently northward, weaving through the last snow shadows and patches of stubborn moss. The trees here were older, taller but not looming. They gave space. They let light through in thin ribbons. You passed a fallen log you once sat on as a child, pretending it was a dragon. Now it was softened with fungus, covered in frost-kissed lichen, its spine cracked but resting proudly. You ran your hand along it. "Still here," you whispered. The wind answered by lifting your hood, briefly, before settling again. By midday, you reached the fork, and there was Bjorn, sitting cross-legged on a flat rock, chewing something and watching a squirrel with more interest than it likely deserved. He looked up, grinned. Thought you might turn around. I almost did. Glad you didn't. He stood and stretched, then handed you a strip of dried fish wrapped in cloth. For later, or now if you're already tired. You laughed and tucked it into your pouch. Together you continued. This part of the trail hadn't been walked in seasons. Branches reached low, some across the path like curious arms. You moved carefully, your steps quieter now, not out of fear, but out of respect. The pines here whispered. Not with secrets, with memory. Each needle underfoot felt like a note in a song you used to know, now remembered in fragments. The air smelled of bark, of thawed stone, of something older than maps. At one point Bjorn stopped and pointed at a tree with a split trunk. See that? He asked. That's where my brother claimed he saw a spirit. Said it was a woman made of fog. She spoke in riddles. Did you believe him? He shrugged. At the time, no. But now? You both looked at the tree. The split was smooth. The inside bark was darker but not rotted, just waiting. Maybe the spirit was just the wind, you said. Maybe the wind was trying to say something important. You nodded. By dusk, you found a clearing, a shallow bowl in the land, ringed with stone and moss, where a small stream ran, partially thawed. You set camp there, lighting a small fire with care, feeding it slowly, speaking to it with soft breath, rather than flint and impatience. Bjorn laid out 2 cloaks and a pot of root stew he'd brought from the village. You ate slowly in silence, each spoonful grounding you a little more in the present moment. As the fire dimmed, you took out the spiral cloth. Bjorn watched it flicker in the low light. You ever think, he said, that maybe the spiral doesn't end because we're not meant to reach the center? You turned it in your hands. Maybe the center isn't a place, you replied. Maybe it's a moment. He looked at you, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. That sounds like something a spirit would say. You smiled. Then maybe I'm turning into one. He chuckled, then lay back against his rolled cloak. Don't float off yet, he murmured. I need you for second watch. You took first watch. The forest hummed, not with danger, but with presence. Every crackle of wood, every drip of meltwater, every gust of wind through branches. It felt like being read a story with no words. You didn't feel small. You felt placed. When your watch ended, you woke Bjorn, then lay beside the fire and closed your eyes. Your dream was not of spirals or halls. It was of pine needles falling slowly through light, of footsteps that didn't echo, but left warmth behind them, of a voice, not familiar, but known, saying, simply, you are where the path begins to remember you. You woke before dawn, frost on your boots, breath steady, and beside you, the stream whispered something you couldn't yet translate, but deeply understood. There's a kind of land that doesn't belong to any map. Not because it's hidden or forbidden, but because it shifts, slowly and subtly, every time someone steps into it. You found such a place the next morning. The trail you and Bjorn followed was faint now, barely more than a suggestion. Snowmelt had turned the path into rivulets of water and mud, and the trees began to thicken, not in hostility but in quiet mystery. Birdsong changed here. It was less melodic, more questioning, as if the birds weren't singing to each other, but to the forest itself. Bjorn walked slightly ahead, his boots squelching softly in the damp earth. You followed without speaking, letting your eyes roam, watching how the light filtered through the branches like rippling water. Every so often you'd see something out of place, a stone too round, as if shaped by hands. A stump split down the middle, not by weather, but by deliberate force. Once you spotted a small wooden carving perched in the fork of a tree, faded by sun and time, its face indistinct, its arms crossed in quiet warning or welcome. You didn't touch it. Around midday, you stopped by a small pool, fed by trickles from melting snow. The water was dark, reflecting the canopy above so perfectly it seemed like a doorway. You knelt to drink, cupping the water in your hands. It tasted like old secrets. Bjorn joined you a moment later, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "We're off. The old path," he said. You nodded. "I think we're meant to be." He looked at you, half smiling. "You say that like it's a good thing." You didn't answer. Instead, you reached into your pouch and pulled out the spiral cloth. You held it in the sunlight. The threads shimmered faintly. Then, without speaking, you tied it to a low-hanging branch above the pool. Bjorn watched. "Leaving breadcrumbs?" he asked. "No," you said softly. "Leaving a hello." The forest changed again that afternoon. The trees here were older, thick, gnarled, some with bark twisted in spirals like frozen wind. The ground rose and fell without reason, forming dips and ridges like the breath of a sleeping giant. You slowed your pace, not from exhaustion, but from awe. You were not tired. You were listening. And the forest, in its own ancient way, was speaking. Back at one point, you reached a clearing, a circle of stone pillars half fallen, covered in moss and lichen. In the center, a patch of wildflowers had bloomed early, yellow and white, defiant against the season. Bjorn stepped into the circle and turned slowly. "I think this was a place for remembering." You joined him. "Or for forgetting," you said. You both sat there for a time, letting the quiet settle over your shoulders like a second cloak. You thought of the burned village, of Elira's maps, of the carved spiral in the stone. You thought of your mother's silence, seen as knowing glances the way the stream had begun to speak again, and for a moment you felt suspended, not forward, not backward, just present. That night, you made camp beside a hollow tree with roots like fingers. Bjorn found dry branches and you lit a small fire using the flint your mother had slipped into your pack. As the flames took, you burned the thread Sina had given you, the one bound with red twine. The smoke rose slowly, curling like a spiral, then vanished. Bjorn watched it go, then said, "Do you think they're watching us?" You didn't ask who he meant. You simply replied, "Yes." The stars came out later, filtered through the branches. You lay on your back, tracing constellations that looked almost, but not quite, like those above your village. "Same sky," Bjorn said. "Different angle," you murmured. He sat up and poked at the fire. "I used to think leaving would feel like running," he said. "But it doesn't. It feels like breathing differently." You nodded. "It's not escape," you said. "It's arrival." Sleep came gently that night. Your dreams were scattered soft. You saw footprints filled with rainwater, hands offering you stones carved with hollow centers, and a face, unfamiliar but not unknown, watching from behind a curtain of ivy. When you awoke, dawn was just a thought on the edge of the sky. Bjorn was still asleep, curled beneath his cloak. You stood, stretched, and walked a few paces away. Ahead, through the trees, you saw something new. A path. Narrow. Fresh. Winding eastward. You smiled, and for the first time since leaving the village you felt the pull of direction. The road was narrow, but it was unmistakably a road. Not one made by carts or herds, not rutted or carved or announced. It was the kind of path that revealed itself only to those moving slowly enough to notice. You stepped onto it after a quiet breakfast of dried berries and hard bread, the fire's last breath curling behind you in the cold morning air. Bjorn stretched, yawned, then looked eastward, toward the path you had spotted. "Do we follow it?" he asked. You nodded. "It feels invited." He didn't question the word. He had long since learned that not every reason was made of facts. The path wound through thinner woods now. The trees stood farther apart, and the ground underfoot was soft with old needles and damp leaves. Sunlight touched the forest floor more often here, dappling the way ahead in shifting gold. You walked in silence for a long time. It wasn't the heavy kind of silence, but the thoughtful kind, like a long breath being held together. The only sounds were the creak of your leather packs, the occasional snap of twig underfoot, and the rhythmic whisper of wind high above, combing through the branches like careful fingers. Mid-morning brought you to a series of standing stones, 5 in total, each one no taller than your hip, spaced evenly beside the path like sentinels. They were etched with unfamiliar markings, smoother than runes, more circular. You stopped beside the center one and touched its surface, warm from sunlight, but also something more. Bjorn placed his palm on the nearest stone. He didn't speak for a while, then quietly, "It feels like it remembers being touched." You understood. There was something in the texture of the stone, the way it met your skin, not as resistance, but as recognition. Further along the path, the trees thinned more dramatically, giving way to a stretch of meadow still waking from winter. Patches of snow clung stubbornly to shaded edges, but wild crocuses had begun to emerge, delicate, purple, and fearless. You knelt to touch one. Its petals trembled slightly under your fingertip but held firm. Life, you thought, is so often quiet when it begins. Beyond the meadow, the ground rose gently, forming a low ridge. From the top, you could see further than you had in days, and there, not far off, was a shape. At first, it seemed like a trick of light, a structure half swallowed by overgrowth, walls bent inward, roof collapsed in places. You pointed. Bjorn shielded his eyes. A hall, or what's left of one. You descended carefully, boots crunching through old pine cones and patches of thawed grass. As you approached, the shape resolved itself into a longhouse, abandoned, weathered, but still standing in spirit. Its bones were intact. The doorway leaned, but the threshold was clear. Someone, long ago, had built it to last. You stepped inside first. It smelled of damp earth, of lichen and time. Faint traces of soot clung to the hearthstone, and a tattered fur still hung in one corner, half consumed. By moss, you set down your pack. Bjorn whistled softly. "I think we found someone's memory." You nodded. This was meant to be found. You spent the afternoon quietly, repairing a bit of the entrance with fallen branches, sweeping leaves from the interior, laying out cloaks to dry in a patch of sun that slipped through a crack in. The roof. There was peace in it. Not comfort exactly, but purpose. At dusk, you lit a small fire in the hearth, careful to keep it low. The smoke curled lazily upward, escaping through the broken rafters. You boiled snow for tea and added a pinch of dried mint from Sina's pouch. Bjorn sipped slowly, then leaned back against the wall. "This place, it's like a pause," he said. You understood what he meant. It didn't feel like the end of a journey. It felt like the moment between steps. That night, as the fire died down, you took out the spiral stone again. You held it to the firelight, then set it in the center of the hearth. Bjorn didn't ask why. He just watched. And as sleep settled over you both, the last thing you saw was the flicker of flame reflecting in the spiral's curve. And for a moment, it looked like a doorway. By morning, the fire had faded to ash, but the warmth lingered, nestled deep in the stones of the hearth, clinging to your sleeping cloak and the wool beneath your shoulder blades. You awoke slowly, not startled, just aware that something had changed. The light inside the longhouse was soft, filtered through the broken slats of roof and walls. Dust drifted in slow spirals, catching the sun like memory. Bjorn was already awake, seated cross-legged beside the cold hearth, hands wrapped around the spiral stone. He didn't speak, and you didn't rush to join him. You sat up quietly, stretching, listening to the distant chirr of waking birds and the occasional creak of wood resettling. When you finally moved to sit beside him, he handed you the stone. "It was warm this morning," he said softly.
Like someone had touched it from inside. You turned it in your hands. Its weight was unchanged, but it did seem to pulse faintly, like it had been part of a dream and forgotten its way out. You didn't ask what he meant. You understood. This
house, this broken, buried place, was more than a ruin. It was something left behind on purpose, not abandoned, preserved. That day you stayed, not because of fear, because of invitation. You explored the space more thoroughly. The central beam still held firm, marked with old carvings worn by smoke and time. You traced them slowly, brushing away layers of dust to reveal spirals, wave-like curves, symbols you couldn't quite name. In one corner, half covered and fallen, you found a wooden box rotted along one edge but still sealed. Inside, wrapped in cloth stiff with age, were 3 items: a rusted pendant shaped like a rising bird, a strip of leather tooled with simple runes, and a single bronze needle. Bjorn looked over your shoulder as you unwrapped them. "Not treasure," he said. "No," you replied. "Something more." You laid them gently on the stone ledge near the hearth. "Offerings?" he asked. "Memories." You spent the rest of the day gathering small things: bits of dry wood for the next night's fire, stones to reinforce the sagging threshold, pine needles to scatter across the dirt floor, releasing their scent each time you stepped. It wasn't rebuilding, it was tending, and tending was sacred. You and Bjorn didn't speak much that afternoon, but when you did, your voices were softer, like you were guests in a home whose hosts were just out of view. At twilight, you sat just outside the longhouse, feet in the damp grass, eyes on the western sky. It was painted in shades of gold and lilac, the sun slipping gently behind distant trees. Bjorn passed you a bit of dried fruit. "What do you think this place was?" he asked. You took a moment before answering. "Resting point. Remembering place. Somewhere between." He nodded. "Like us." You smiled. That night, you lit the fire again, slightly larger this time, just enough to warm the space fully. The light danced across the old carvings, casting long shadows along the walls. The pendant gleamed faintly in the flicker, like it still carried a story just beyond reach. After a quiet meal, you placed the spiral stone on the hearth once more, but this time, you added the bronze needle and the strip of leather beside it. Silent exchange, a gesture of respect. Before sleep, Bjorn murmured, "Do you think we'll know when it's time to leave?" You looked toward the rafters, where a faint breeze stirred a loose strand of moss. "Yes," you said. "Not because something pushes us, because something opens." Sleep came easily that night, not as escape but as continuation. You dreamed of a great tree growing through the center of the longhouse, its roots wrapping the hearth, its branches arching into stars. You stood beneath it, and in your hand, the spiral stone glowed. Around you, voices whispered, not words but tones. They sang of things not yet done, of paths not yet walked, and they were patient. When you awoke, it was still dark, but the fire had not gone out, and the spiral stone, for the first time, was glowing faintly of its own accord. It was a strange kind of light that woke you. Not sunlight, not firelight. Something softer, cool and silvery, like moonlight seen through water. The spiral stone at the hearth was glowing, not brightly, not urgently, just enough to cast a gentle sheen across the carved beam and the old bird-shaped pendant beside it. Bjorn stirred on the other side of the longhouse, pulling his cloak tighter. You sat up slowly, blinking the dream from your eyes. It had been the same tree again, the one from the night before. This time, its branches had bloomed with tiny lights and its roots had reached into your hands. You stood barefoot on the cool, packed dirt and walked to the hearth. The spiral stone pulsed gently beneath your fingers. Not hot, not cold, just alive. Bjorn joined you quietly. He didn't ask what you were doing. He only knelt beside you and placed his hand on the edge of the stone. And for a moment, the longhouse breathed with you. You didn't speak until the light faded, slowly, softly, like mist returning to the sea. After a long pause, Bjorn whispered, "I think it's telling us it's time." You nodded. You spent the morning packing in near silence, moving as if through ritual rather than routine. You left behind the bronze needle, the leather rune strip, and the bird pendant, placed with care beside the hearthstone, not as loss, as continuity. When the door closed behind you, you looked back once, and the longhouse looked whole somehow, less broken than before, as though it had stood up straighter while you were inside. You followed no obvious trail. but your feet knew the way. The forest welcomed your return with birdsong. The wind moved in slow circles as if retracing your earlier steps with approval. Bjorn walked slightly behind, humming a low tune that you recognized from the harvest festival. Something simple, almost childish, but grounding. By midday, the trees began to change again. The bark grew smoother, the branches higher, and between them glimpses of sky widened. Then, as you crested a shallow rise, you saw them. Standing stones, not scattered this time. A full circle. 12 in all, rising from moss-covered earth like fingers pointing inward. Some were cracked, others leaned. But they formed a perfect ring, and in the center grass had grown despite the season. You stopped at the edge of the circle. Bjorn joined you, quiet now. The place pulsed, not with sound, but with presence. You stepped forward one pace at a time. At the center of the ring stood a stone basin, shallow and wide, filled with clear water that didn't reflect the sky. Only the spiral. And beneath the surface a single stone, flat black marked with white lines that shimmered faintly. You knelt beside it. The water was impossibly still. Bjorn said, "It feels like a question." You nodded. You reached in, slowly, letting your hand move through the cool water. When your fingers touched the stone, a pulse moved through your palm, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. You lifted it gently. The spiral on it was different, more intricate, layered. The lines split and rejoined, forming paths within paths. On the back, a single rune, Kenaz, light, fire, revelation. You turned to Bjorn. His face was solemn. "I think this is what the cloth meant," he said. "Not the journey itself, but where it leads to." Questions. You smiled. "Or where it leads to?" Listening. You sat in the center of the circle as afternoon softened, and one by one, you placed the old spiral stone beside the new one. 2 voices in one place. And then you waited. Not for a sign. Not for a command, but for the silence to shift, and it did. The wind moved differently. The birds paused. The stones, somehow, leaned closer. And for a brief moment you heard it. A sound like singing, low, harmonic, like stone and wind and memory made music. It passed through you, not around. It stayed in your ribs like breath held between words. And then it was gone. When you opened your eyes, the sun had slipped behind the trees. Bjorn was watching you, not with curiosity, but with knowing. You stood, wrapped the new spiral, stone and cloth, and stepped gently out of the circle. Behind you, the stones stood tall again, as if pleased. That night, you camped beside a shallow stream, letting the fire burn a little longer than usual. Bjorn poked at the coals. "So now what?" You looked at the spiral stone. "We keep walking. To where?" "Wherever the next silence sings." He raised an eyebrow. "And if it doesn't?" You smiled. "Then we sing to it first." The next morning arrived, not with color, but with quiet. Mist lay low across the land like a memory that hadn't yet decided whether to stay. The fire you and Bjorn had kindled the night before had gone out, but its warmth lingered faintly in the stones around it. You could still smell the pine smoke in your hair, in your cloak. The spiral stone, the new one, lay wrapped in cloth at the top of your pack. Its weight pressed gently between your shoulder blades, not burdensome, but present, like a thought that never quite leaves. You packed in silence, sharing glances rather than words. Bjorn seemed quieter too. Not somber, but inward-facing, like someone reading a long letter written in a language he only half understood. When you stepped back onto the trail, the mist parted ahead of you, slow and respectful. The path now ran, straight for a time, an odd thing after so many days of twists and turns. The land here opened, hills rolling like waves caught mid-motion, the forest thinning until it stood only in scattered clumps, like thoughts that hadn't coalesced into belief. You walked beside fields dotted with frost-bitten stones and stretches of scrub grass, brittle but strong. This land feels Clean, Bjorn said eventually. You nodded. Like it's been waiting. For what? Neither of you said. Just past midday, you reached the base of a hill. Not the tallest hill you had seen, not the steepest, but it had a kind of stillness that drew your steps upward. Bjorn stopped, squinting at its peak. There's something up there. You shaded your eyes. A shape, not large, but definite. Stone, maybe, or wood. It stood in contrast to the pale sky behind it, just enough to suggest purpose. Without speaking, you began the climb. The slope was gentle, but long. The kind of climb that didn't test your legs, but your patience. Each step felt deliberate, like it mattered more than the last. Halfway up, you paused to look back. The landscape stretched behind you, open and honest. No tricks of forest shadow, no hidden paths. Just land as it was. It felt good to see it clearly. When you reached the top, the wind met you first. Cool, unhurried, wrapping your face like an old friend brushing hair from your brow. The shape revealed itself as a cairn, a pile of stones carefully arranged, each one placed by a different hand across time. It wasn't large, barely knee-high, but it was complete. There were feathers tied to some of the stones with strips of sinew. Bits of carved wood nestled between them. One small bowl, made of fired clay, rested at the center, half filled with dried berries turned dark and shriveled with age. Bjorn knelt beside it. These are offerings. You nodded, and without knowing why, you pulled out the spiral stone. You placed it in the bowl. Bjorn raised an eyebrow. You sure? Yes. He didn't press. He pulled something from his own pack, a small carving of a bear chipped at the ear, and placed it beside your stone. You both stood. Neither of you said anything. There was nothing to explain. The wind passed over, the cairn like a sigh, and then, softly, a raven called in the distance. You looked up. 2 birds wheeled above the hill, circling once, twice, then gliding eastward. Bjorn watched them go. I think that's our direction, he said. You didn't disagree. The descent was easier, though neither of you rushed it. You reached the base of the hill just as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the grass. You walked a little farther, until the land dipped and a cluster of birches offered shelter for the night. The fire was easy to build, dry twigs, bark curls, and the last bit of pitch Bjorn had brought from the village. That night, as flames licked softly at the air, you felt something shift, not outside, inside, as though you had passed through something, not a gate, not a trial, just a place that needed to be crossed. Bjorn handed you a cup of warm water laced with pine needles. Tastes like courage, he said. You smiled. Or stubbornness, you replied. Same thing, some days. You both laughed quietly, letting the sound join the wind. Before sleep, you looked up at the stars, brighter now somehow, more sharply defined against the dark. And as you drifted into slumber, your last thought was not of where you were going next, but of how much lighter you felt after leaving something behind. You entered the valley on the 3rd morning after leaving the hill. There was no sign to mark its name, no carved runestone, no weathered post. Just a soft turning of the path, a slope downward, and a feeling that the world had decided to draw in its breath. The trees here were shorter, more crooked, their limbs bowing toward the center of the valley like listeners leaning in. Moss grew thick along their trunks, and the stones scattered beneath them were round and dark, as if smoothed by centuries of thought. You paused at the edge, where the trail hesitated, where even Bjorn fell quiet. This place is awake, he said after a while. You didn't answer. You felt it too. Not a threat, but a tension. The air was still, yet full, like a great room in which someone had just left, their presence still vibrating through the beams and floorboards. You continued. Inward slowly, the valley did not resist. It accepted your presence the way a river accepts a stone. But you felt each step land more carefully than usual. your boot soles cushioned by moss, your breath instinctively quieted. You walked for hours, saying little. Around midday, you came to a clearing. In its center stood a single tree, not tall, not grand, but unmistakably central. Its bark was pale, almost white, and carved with dozens of shallow marks, some runic, some abstract, some no more than scratches. But together, they formed something that felt both ancient and unfinished. You approached first, hand outstretched. When your palm met the bark, the tree felt warm. Bjorn stepped beside you and touched one of the carvings. Some of these are names, he said. Some are prayers. Some are just presents, you added. You circled the tree once. On its far side, sheltered from the wind, sat a small bench of stone. It was worn smooth, edges rounded by time, or by those who had come before. You sat. Bjorn joined you. The clearing was utterly quiet. Even the birds seemed to pause here. And in that stillness, you both breathed, not with effort, but with relief. The kind of breath that comes when you realize you've been holding one in without knowing. After some time, Bjorn asked, "Do you think this is a destination?" You looked at the tree again. "No," you said, "but it might be a mirror." Considered that. Then he stood and walked to a nearby patch of bare earth. With the tip of his boot, he drew a small spiral. You joined him, kneeling to trace it more deeply with your finger. Then, next to it, you drew another spiral. Smaller, tighter. Like the echo of the first, Bjorn smiled. Like footsteps following footsteps. You remained in the clearing for the rest of the day. There was no shelter, but none was needed. The wind was gentle. The tree seemed to hold a perimeter of calm around itself, as if claiming a small space where rest was safe. That evening, you did not light a fire. Instead, you unrolled your cloak and lay beneath the tree, its pale branches stretching above you like a net of thoughts. Bjorn lay nearby, arms behind his head. "Do you miss the village?" he asked. You thought for a long while before answering. "I miss its shape, its smell, the rhythm of it. But not the walls?" You shook your head slowly. "No, I think we brought the hearth with us." The stars were unusually bright that night, unmoving, patient. You dreamed of a valley shaped like an ear, its hills curved inward, its rivers humming softly. In the center stood the white tree, but now it spoke not in words but in images. You saw the longhouse where you were born. You saw your mother's hand stitching a cloak. You saw the old shield you once found buried in the sand. Then the images faded, replaced by a single phrase. Not all homes are places. Some are paths. You woke before dawn. Bjorn was still asleep. You sat up quietly, the earth cool beneath your hands. The valley held its hush, but the tree now looked different, not glowing, not changed, just complete. You rose, gathered your pack, and tied a thread of red yarn around one of the branches. A small gesture, a thank you. Then you turned toward the far end of the clearing. The path continued. Narrow, misty, curving just out of sight. You waited until the sun had touched the top of the hill. Then you said softly to the valley, "I'm still listening," and stepped forward. The fog met you just beyond the valley. It did not rush forward or swirl dramatically. It simply arrived, layered, quiet, complete. It flowed through the low trees like breath through ribs, soft and persistent, and the path ahead became a suggestion, more than a certainty. Bjorn caught up beside you, yawning softly. "Missed again?" You nodded, pulling your cloak tighter. He chuckled, brushing dew from his sleeves. "Feels like walking through someone else's dream." "It might be," you replied, not entirely joking. You walked slowly, your boots making almost no sound on the damp earth. The fog softened everything, sounds, edges, even thoughts. You found yourself speaking less and sensing more, listening not just with your ears but with your whole self. Every now and then a shape would emerge from the mist, a stone, a twisted tree, a bird. perched and watching. None of it startled you. Nothing felt threatening. It was a strange kind of peace, walking through what you couldn't fully see but trusted all the same. For a while, you and Bjorn separated without meaning to. He veered left at a bend you didn't notice. You kept right, and suddenly there was only silence beside you. You paused. The fog wrapped around your shoulders like a shawl. "Bjorn?" You called. No answer, but you weren't afraid. You knew he was close. Instead, you sat on a low, mossy stone and closed your eyes. Sometimes fog isn't just a thing to pass through. Sometimes it's a place, a moment, an invitation. You slowed your breathing, listened, not for footsteps, not for voices, but for memory. And memory came, not in pictures, but in feelings. You remembered the first time you saw a storm roll in from the sea, the weight of the air, the electricity before the rain. You remembered Elira's hands tracing, the spiral on your palm. You remembered sitting beside the stream, watching thaw water carve new paths. Then, beneath those memories, another, older. Your first night alone in the forest as a child, when you stayed out past dusk and forgot your way home. You remembered how the dark pressed close and how the owl called again and again until you followed its sound back to safety. You opened your eyes, and through the fog, just barely, you saw a faint spiral traced on a nearby tree trunk. Not carved, not burned, just traced, in dew, with a fingertip. You stood, moved toward it, and as you did, the fog shifted, revealed a narrow corridor between two leaning birch trees, and there, on the other side, Bjorn. He was standing still, eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. When he opened them, he saw you and grinned. "Thought I lost you," he said. "I found something instead." You replied. You didn't explain. You didn't need to. The fog continued as you walked together again, step by slow step. It seemed to guide you now, thinning when the path needed clarity, thickening when stillness was required. At one point, you passed a small stone cairn, barely knee-high. You paused beside it and placed a pine needle atop the highest stone. Bjorn followed suit, adding a sliver of bark. "We're not the first," he said. "No," you agreed. "But we're part of it now." Eventually the fog began to thin, not all at once, just a subtle brightening. The silhouettes of trees grew sharper. The sky, once blank and gray, showed hints of blue behind the white. You emerged into a clearing, a soft, circular space ringed with ferns and low stones. The center held a shallow pool of clear water, perfectly still, reflecting the fog as it lifted piece by piece. Bjorn knelt and cupped some water into his hands. "Colder than I thought," he murmured, splashing a few drops onto his face. You sat beside him, watching the ripples fade. There was peace in this place, the kind that didn't declare itself but waited to be recognized, the kind that needed fog to be fully felt. You stayed until the sun crested above the trees, and the mist finally let go. Then you stood quietly and continued. The path was clear again, but the fog had left something behind in you, a softness, a sense of being gently seen, and as you walked, you whispered to the air, not expecting a reply, "Thank you for holding us." And in the hush that followed, the trees nodded. By the time you reached the ridge, the sky had shifted to gold, not the fire gold of battle or the sharp gold of high summer. This was a mellow, patient gold, the color of endings wrapped in acceptance. You and Bjorn walked without speaking, your steps light, the path now smooth beneath your boots. Below, in the valley to the north, smoke curled from the rooftops of a small settlement. It wasn't your village, but it felt familiar in the way of warm bread and quiet laughter. Bjorn pointed. "Do we go down?" You studied the shapes. Rooftops angled with care, small gardens still holding frost, a narrow stream that cut through the center like a silver ribbon. "We could," you said softly. "But I think we've already arrived." He nodded. not needing more. Instead, you turned toward the western slope where the path curved not downward but around. A circle. That night you camped beneath a leaning fir, the stars blinking awake above you. The fire crackled gently between you, throwing shadows against your faces like old friends whispering stories. Bjorn leaned back on his elbows, chewing on a sprig of spruce. "I keep thinking about that spiral," he said. "The one on the stone, the one on the cloth." You turned the pouch in your lap where the original spiral cloth still rested, faded now, softened by touch and time. "Me too," you replied. It never really pointed to a place, just a way. He tilted his head, watching the embers drift. "And this way, where does it end?" You smiled gently. "Nowhere, I hope." The fire burned low, and with it, your thoughts quieted, like waves settling after a long tide. You dreamed that night of weaving, not cloth, but memory. You sat at a loom not made of wood but of wind and roots, and every strand you pulled through came from a different part of your life. The sound of your mother's song, the crunch of frost under your boots, the warmth of Sina's salve on your shoulder, the glint of Bjorn's laughter. You didn't weave a tapestry, you wove a path, and at the center of the spiral there was not an end, but a doorway. You awoke with the dream still on your tongue. Bjorn was already packing. "We should follow the river a while," he said. "Feels like it wants company." You followed it for 2 more days. You met a trader with a cart full of salt and stories. You shared dried berries with a quiet boy who pointed you toward a spring where the water tasted like clean beginnings. And finally, you found a place where the land flattened, the trees opened, and a circle of stones stood waiting. Smaller than the others, more intimate. You both knew what it meant. You stepped inside. Bjorn placed his old bear carving in the grass. You laid down the cloth. And in that quiet circle you both sat, not to decide where to go next, but to thank where you had already been. There were no revelations, no final answers. Only this: you had walked. You had listened. You had returned, not to where you started, but to a self that now understood silence as a language and direction as a rhythm. That night you camped without a fire. The stars were enough. And as you lay on your back, cloak pulled to your chin, the spiral cloth tucked beneath your head, you whispered to the wind, "I am home." And the wind, like every teacher before it, answered not with words but with presence.